Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about sex and religion. Now, this is something that can really get controversial for some people because I was just talking to somebody who she's older. She has definitely explained to me that she is celibate and had the conversation with somebody that she was interested in recently. And, they were having a sex talk or, kind of gotten around to it. And that they don't do sex outside of a marriage. And the concern has everything to do with not wanting the relationship to be just about sex. And how captivating, because, face it, sex is something that really is powerful to us. This is why we have a sex podcast, why we do sex, and so many other good things about it. But the problem with doing it outside of a marriage is because a marriage has the built-in, the contract. There's the commitment there. And with that situation, you're sort of forced together. You have to work out your problems. You got to stay. A lot of people worry about having sex, and then, when the sex wears off, the interest wears off because it can wane. It's like many things. I mean, we get really caught up into pleasure. And then when the pleasure itself isn't like it used to be, because you can kind of go to that, your go-to thing too often, and all of a sudden it loses its interest, its appeal. I think we've all kind of felt that chemistry thing when it starts to wane. So what happens when there's no relationship as like a marriage? And if it's just a sexual thing, then when the sex goes and it seems like the connection goes for a lot of people, or at least for one and not the other. So what's there to bring you back into the relationship? And when you have a marriage, which is the way religions like to, they will sanction that. And that's part of what it is. That's part of the relationship. And, they go on to say that if you're not in a committed relationship, i.e. married, having sex is taboo. And there's lots of reasons for that. One of which is really to explain what happens in sex. There is, just a normal thing. You could create babies. You bring kids into the world. And when you don't have a commitment around the relationship in order to deal with all the things that happen in a relationship. I mean, not just the making of kids, but sex is a part of it. Then when you have that responsibility, that commitment, you stay locked in to that commitment. You stay there. And that's very important. Because in the minds of the people who are in the relationship who have the kid, they have to want to be there, to be the parent, to deal with all the things that come up. And some things, if you didn't have a commitment, such as, the marriage contract, some people would just quit because they would say, oh, this is just too hard. I just want to walk away. But they say, well, you can't walk away. You're married. See, there's that little thing that triggers people to bring them back. And that's just part of the significance of it. Now, I brought this topic up, the significance of this is the sex and religion, and in the context of being married is where, sex is a part of the relationship. It's part of the commitment. It's totally sanctioned. It's totally okay. And where religions get into telling you a lot of bad things about yourself if you're having sex outside of marriage. And they have their reasons for doing it. I'm not saying they're all good reasons. I'm just saying they have their reasons. And and as I've said, I've talked about, what are the consequences of having sex? Kids, namely kids, and having that relationship means that they are going to be cared for. It's expected. And you don't just get to walk away from your responsibility. And that's a good thing that you don't just get to walk away. Now, that word also applies equally to both partners, not just one. So I asked this question of you, the listener. How about your feelings about sex and religion? Ask yourself this question. Where does that fit in your life? Has that ever been something that's been talked about between you and your parents, let's say, or you and your peers? And over time, have you become a conservative thinker? And I'll describe the conservative thinker as being sexual inside of a marriage. Being conservative thinking is not a bad thing. I'm just using that as a comparison and have to put words on it here. Or are you a little more liberal and sex outside of marriage is okay for you, and you feel like this whole thing about religion dictating the constraints on people's sexual habits is a dangerous thing? Because why? Is it because men are interpreting the religion, or is it the fact that somebody else is telling you that if you have sex outside of a marriage that you are a bad person? And these kinds of things can really have an impact on how people feel about themselves. And there becomes a lot of guilt surrounding how one feels. And you can kind of have this yo-yo thing. You're drawn to being sexual because you like how it feels, and then you feel guilty afterwards, so you want to repent, and you go back and forth. And if you're involved with somebody, maybe they have the same background, so there's this guilt-pleasure thing going back and forth, or maybe they don't. And they're kind of on the sidelines trying to figure out, okay, where are you going to land? Because when you go through your guilty phase, then you throw it onto the other person, they feel guilty. And boy, that yo-yo thing can really get people worked up. And it's crazy making, for lack of a better term. And how have you dealt with that? I mean, have you had that experience? And if you had that guilty pleasure kind of thing, if you've been there, how did you stop, if you did? Or do you continue on and just deal with the guilt afterwards? I mean, were you being sexual because you were being rebellious, or you were being curious and you stumbled across something and found out there was some sort of physical pleasure? Or did you have sex, get found out, and then someone threw the religion thing on you to make you conform? And did you feel guilty about it? Ask yourself, what's your relationship to this? Like I say, the sex and the religion. The irony is that my relationship to this whole thing really didn't have anything to do with anything my parents said. It really had to do with the environment that I was around. Again, not from my parents, but from my friends and their parents. And my friends' parents were very strict, very conservative acting, and they wanted their kids to be the same. Well, because they had a lot of kids, so they couldn't have be too terribly liberal, because with all the kids that they had, then there'd be chaos all the time. And as you know, when you have lots of people in a family, there's always that family dynamic going, but you have to have some semblance of boundaries and to keep things orderly, because if you don't, then all heck can break loose. Look, I'm going to take a break here, and I'll come right back after the commercials.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello, and we're back. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, and I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about sex and religion. So, to kind of pull a thread back from the other segment, I was talking about sex and religion, and why religions have that no sex outside of marriage thing. And okay, so what do you think the idea behind that is? Is it about guilt? No, it's really about responsibility. And I think a lot of people need those boundaries established for themselves or established for them so that they behave responsibly. Because the average human being may try to be responsible, but without boundaries, and what religions do, they write things down. They say, these are the rules, follow these rules, and you are a member. But without those boundaries, even the best of the human beings tend to slip off and do things that aren't in their own best interest. And when you're involving someone else, and the potential in this case is, in particular for younger people who are, being sexual, the potential for them to create the responsibility, that is, i.e. have kids, is very high. And as we have developed as a society, we have learned that having children and raising them within a certain structure with certain guidelines is for their benefit. It's for their survival. So therein, that is why we have the rules that we have. And religions have done this forever and ever. That's, you follow these rules, you're a member, and when you do these things, there are certain rewards that come with it. That is, I've seen where that has been a benefit. A lot of people need that structure. Now, for those who basically eschew that belief, that way of operating, then, what happens to them? Well, they have their own conscience that they have to deal with. And if they have grown up and have known religion, and maybe they're not so religious at this point in time, do they still feel like they act in a way that's responsible to their conscience? And, that's very much a personal thing that you have to deal with. What if, for some people, sex is their religion? Now, that in and of itself seems like a dichotomy. That would be a very difficult one, I think, to try to separate out so where are the boundaries there? Is anything goes sort of thing? And you kind of have to come into something like that with some idea of what, where your limits are or aren't, in order to even try to make that concept work. I think that's a real convoluted thing to try to sort out. I think personally but back to the point of, the whole sex religion thing, the connection, the respect, the responsibility, the boundaries, and, what about those that don't necessarily subscribe to a religion or something that they see as that kind of spiritual connection, out of a book per se. I think people are spiritually connected. They have a sense of right and wrong. They have their morals, their duty to their community, and the desire to be responsible. And for those that have a partner, to be committed to that partner, however that looks. Now, you can take that on a different tack, and you have some religions that practice, say, polyamory. or polygamy. There are religions that frown against that, and there are those that lift it up. So there's your sex and religion question. If those are things that apply to you, how do you see other religions in the way they treat those kinds of relationships? Is it the fact that it's sanctioned, but differently? Let's say if you have a particular faith that believes in not only monogamy, but and what is monogamy? That relationship is with one person. And polygamy would be one person having several other partners. And I guess in this day and age, it's not just a man having several women, but maybe a woman can have several men. I don't know that, but I'm just putting that out there. This is the sexual religion question, and just to kind of open the thought here, how do you feel about that? And in your own experience, what does religion play in your life? Is it the guilt part of it that creates your boundaries, meaning that's your comfort zone? Anything inside of that circle, with guilt being, the thing outside of the circle, or that line that creates the circle, that's the limit. And anything inside that limit is okay, but what falls outside of that limit for you? What falls outside of that line that creates that circle? Okay, so here's the question for you. At what point is it sex? Is it sex when it starts to feel good, or is it sex when you feel guilty? Because if you're taught that you can't have sex until you're married, but if you're young and you're experimenting with this sort of thing, then at what point do you, like I said, where are your boundaries? Is it this little voice that's talking to you in your head, telling you, okay, you better stop now, I mean, do you have that kind of, or did you have that kind of self-control? I mean, if you're young, you're probably experimenting with this, but if, well past young and you've had those sexual experiences, where were you on this whole question? And, ask yourself how much temptation, once you sort of got a taste of this, maybe you hadn't had intercourse, but you experienced some sort of pleasure. And if not just the sex itself, maybe what led up to it. And for a lot of people, and I will say this of guys who are trying to bed girls, what a lot of this is about the guys paying a lot of attention to the girl and her getting the attention. That's kind of how some of these encounters happen. Because, when you're young and your hormones are raging, you're experimenting with things, and you find someone that you're attracted to, we call that sexual chemistry. And it definitely happens for young people. It happens for older people too. And I'm talking about some of these first experiences and how your mind gets shaped around, the boundaries and how you deal with the guilt, and somebody telling you you're a bad person if you do this, or if you don't do this, then you're a bad person. Those things can be dizzying. You can get your head spinning. But back to the, getting the attention, and girls feeling like they are very special because the guy is totally focused on them, giving them 100% of the attention. And then when the sexual encounter happens, if it does, the guy feeling guilty and then not being around. And then the girl feeling used. And her now being trapped in the spiral of guilt, probably having heard that this is what happens when you do sex outside of marriage, and the boys is coming to use you, and so on and so forth. I mean, you get where the picture is going. It can be very devastating because now you've got to deal with the hurt. And by the way, I am just creating an example here, and it could be same sex. And it can be girl chasing guy, have sexual encounter, then she just leaves him. So they all apply here, equally. So I'm not picking on anyone or excluding anyone. I'm really merely giving an example, an illustration of how, the dynamic, and then, insert your relationship type here. But this is all, I think, very much tied to, our whole sex and religion in the abstinence model, which teaches people something very specific. And I think there is reason for that. And I will get into that in a minute. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello, welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm talking about sex and religion. And, I left off the last thread. I'm going to pull something back at, and I was talking about young people and the abstinence model and why that is taught. And it has a lot to do with the fact that, how many young people do you know? And when I say young, I'm saying, say, somebody under 25, under 20. Usually I'm thinking about teenagers, somebody in high school, and, they experiment with sex. There's no question about it. But the reason they talk about abstinence to this particular age group is because they obviously have the potential to create kids, but with no way of supporting them. And that is that's an awesome responsibility, bringing a child into the world. So they figure if they teach them abstinence and put religion behind it, it's going to have more punch. Because there's a lot of things in religion about that they're great teachings about respect, self-respect, responsibility, duty to your community, that sort of thing. I like that. And then they mix this conversation about sex into it as if when we talk about sex, and when you link it to all of these other things in terms of being responsible, it sounds good. When you take that out of context and then try to use religion as something to tell people what they can and can't do, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying there are a lot of people that need that kind of structure in order to keep themselves out of a lot of trouble. The kind of trouble that they can't get themselves out of, and it winds up being a burden placed on lots of other people. And in particular, when you're young and you're being sexually active, think about this. When a baby comes into the world and you're responsible for him or her, then your life takes on a different trajectory. Ideas and plans and things that you may have had, they now have to shift because of the responsibility that you now have. So think about it. Where else, we talk about the religion. Why is it a good thing? And I'll say it this way. Where else are you going to find something in life that gives you the punch, the impact to make people conform? In a good way. Where else do you find that but religion? There are not too many places that I can think of. And it's the kind of thing that most people are aware of, so the idea gets reinforced a lot. Now, next what comes to mind are people who, understanding the responsibility, or as they've been taught to learn, you have sex inside of a marriage union, that wind up getting married because of sex. Yeah, they have a few things that are in common that they like, but they find that they have such strong chemistry between them. That's how they're feeling. It says, okay, we're going to get married so that we can not feel guilty about having sex. And I wonder how long that's going to last. I don't know. I mean, I have talked to a lot of people that have gotten married and kind of made the comment that, that was one of the reasons why we got married, because we didn't want to feel guilty about that. And they got that. They have that. Now, a number of the people that I talked to, they had since left that relationship. That marriage thing is something that happened when they were really young. And that seemed to be a very recurring theme, that sex, we wanted to feel like we were doing the right thing, so we got married before we had sex, and then we had sex in the relationship, and then we were young, and the relationship just kind of grew apart. We got divorced or separated or something to that effect. And the people I've talked to, a lot of them carry guilt feelings because when they look back on it, they realize that that's why they got married, because they wanted to be sexual and didn't want to be condemned for being found out for having sex outside of the relationship of a marriage. And I respect that. I respect the idea that they were trying to do what they think is the right thing. And, I can't say that there's anything wrong with the fact that they wanted to be married. They wanted to be together. And they might have told themselves a lot of things that weren't true, but they eventually learned for themselves what applies and what didn't apply. So there's no judgment here, not from me. But you have to ask yourself, how were you brought up? What's your boundaries? How do you handle the thought of that? And what about after, there are a lot of people that say, look, I won't be in a relationship unless I've had sex with that person because I don't want to have bad sex. And how am I going to know? That's something that's important. And the conversation I had with someone recently was really, the person had been married several times. And they were really looking more to change their life and be more spiritual based. So being celibate was a very specific choice. And that was to help keep them from actually getting married, because it seemed like for her, having sex also equated with we're going to get married. And having done that a few times, she wanted to do it different the next time around. I sort of quipped that, okay, yeah, there's that. But, men sort of, as you get older, there's some diminishing returns. And I say that, lovingly, that as a man gets older, his ability to perform diminishes. So sometimes, the horny factor kicks in, but it's not just about necessarily being horny, but it's really about wondering, hey, can I still do this? And yes, that's something that men wonder about, because as men age, their ability to perform diminishes. And with medications, it certainly can take away the ability to have an erection. It could take away the sensation overall of the sexual experience. And by that, it then sort of pushes you into, hopefully you are at a place in life where you realize that there's more ways to be sexually aroused and sexually turned on other than just penetration. Sex therapists and sexologists and anybody in that practice, or even in general, when you have a little more, say, imagination about what's possible or what's healthy, or then you start to consider some of these other things. Whereas when you were younger, you didn't even think about it. I don't think a person a man or a woman at 16 or 17 thinks about sexual decline. It just doesn't come into the equation, because most people are in the moment. I mean, think about it. Are you thinking about the future? No. Maybe about whether you want to continue to do this again, but you're not thinking about not being able to do it. So when you do you think about the temptation and, what's going to happen to you afterwards? Is it going to be the guilt thing? Are you going to have to do the confession? How do you get past that? How do you get past the guilt? Because guilt is a part of this. And what is guilt? Guilt is one of those things that was designed to help keep human beings in line. because without it, people would just run and do anything and would have no conscious recollection of their own responsibility for it. Now, it does get used in ways that are not intended. Humans tend to make each other feel guilty about lots of things, and we can flip it on each other. Parents use it all the time. Sometimes it's generally a corrective tool. But when kids grow up with those feelings of guilt a lot, then they kind of grow up with low self-esteem, I think, because they're always second-guessing themselves. They constantly doubt their ability because what they have grown up to learn to experience is feeling bad about themselves for some reason. Feeling bad about yourself. And what brings that about? For some people, it's they quote religious scriptures, words, teachings, things like that, tell them to their kids as if to say, remember, this came out of the good book. We respect the good book. Don't mess with that. So again, how is religion played in your life in regards to sex? Everything I've seen sanctions intimate relationships when you have a committed relationship. But if you're outside of that committed relationship, meaning marriage, it doesn't sanction the sex acts then. So there again, how does that make you feel? Just wanted to put that out there for thought. This is a GSMC Sex Podcast, talking about sex and religion. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.